Thanks a ton, Amy. Thanks for inviting me to this wonderful conference. Sorry I'm not there with everybody, and good morning. It's still morning for me as well. Um, well, one of the things that's nice about this audience is that I don't have to convince people that climate change is actually happening. So the big issue is how do you de-risk that future? Because we're not going to as it seems, we're not going to be able to mitigate the risk very well, given the current political uh, situation. So, how do we de-risk it? How do we adapt to that future? And what do you need to do that? That's what this talk is about. And I want to leave you with one thing, if I leave you with one thing at all. It's that in order to understand adaptation, where to adapt, how to adapt, what to adapt to, you need to do one thing first, which is understand the full physical climate risks that are hitting the organization and all of its physical assets. So let's dive into that. And I'm going to give you just a little bit of technology here. So hopefully it's not going to scare anybody, but it's pretty straightforward. Um, the most important thing is when you're measuring physical risk, you need to understand what's called tail risk. So here's an example. This is Dubai, and of course they have lots of worries about physical risk and climate risk. But in April of 2024, there was a 6 hour period when they had more rain than they'd ever seen in all of recorded history. So let's look at that hazard, which is called maximum daily precipitation. And if you were to look at that historically, this is the gray distribution, you'd find that most likely things happen here, which is below 50 millimeters a day on average. But sometimes it can be up to 100, but never 154. So the big question is, can you actually forecast that event? I mean, would you be able to predict that? And the answer absolutely is not. There's no way we can predict these radical black swans. But what we can do is generate forward-looking information that captures these in the tails, these long tails of low probability events that cause major damage. And doesn't matter if this has a low probability, because if the damage is in the multiple billions, it's still something you want to take into account and potentially adapt to. So let's take an example. Here's Occidental Petroleum for the next 5 years. And what we've done is taken all of their assets and divided them up into buckets. So buckets of 0 to 5% losses, all the way to buckets of over 100% losses. And this is interesting because with this distribution, you start to learn a lot about where to adapt, what to adapt to, how to adapt, and so on. And I want to show you that. So going down, let's take a look at how Occidental, say, compares to an Exxon. Obviously, they benchmark themselves. And here's Exxon with this blue distribution, which is much more scaled to the left. In other words, less damage to its physical assets, and Occidental to the right. So that, normally if you were just looking at their finances, you might not see this, but when you're looking at their physical assets, you'd know that they are mispriced in the market, actually. So let's look at insurability, for example. If you look at all of these assets which are stranded, in other words, you can lose more than the value of the asset in one or a number of events over this 5 year period. You won't be able to find an insurance company to insure that, especially if they have this kind of technology. So you have to self-insure, or you have to adapt to adapt those assets. They're stressed assets, which are still uninsurable because they involve losses of more than 50% of the asset value during this period. And then there are assets at risk. They're probably insured today, but wait till the end of the year, see if you can still insure them. And if you can, it'll probably be more expensive. And then there are the low risk ones which you can insure. So what we've done is taken every corporation that's listed in the 40 largest economies and made public, and you can go to a website and you'll see where to find it, and look at the vulnerability of these companies. So there's Occidental, and it has more than 60% stressed or stranded. Here's Exxon with only about 12% stressed or stranded. So let's ask adaptation issues. I mean, how do we attack this? Where are the assets located? Which assets need adaptation? When does adaptation need to start? And how to adapt? Well, where to adapt, we can look at them on a map, we can color code them, and pretty quickly see that there's a lot of risk down here in Texas and up here in Midwest and in California as well. So if we were to look at Exxon, it's a much bigger corporation, many more assets, but still stranded assets here, Caribbean, in the island states in Western Australia. So we know where they are, but now we can actually dive into this. In the product, you actually click on that bar and you can see it, where these assets are. But when to adapt becomes very important. Well, the stranded assets, of course, you want to adapt now. They are really your big problem. And the question is, do you get rid of them? Do you rebuild elsewhere? Do you adapt them to be able to withstand the stresses? And we'll see what stresses. The stressed assets can wait a little, but not too long, because they are not insurable. And later on, you can look at the at-risk assets. So when to adapt becomes very important, and what to adapt becomes important. So what hazards do we need to adapt to? If you look at Occidental Petroleum, wildfire is their big risk, and so is cyclones, but not as much, and so is flooding. But Exxon is different. It's actually mainly cyclones and flooding. So how should we adapt to these? Well, Occidental is about fire in Wyoming, cyclones in Muscat, and fire in Texas. And Exxon is all about cyclones, which is high winds and high precipitation. So, your infrastructure companies know what to do once you say you want to reduce the risk of cyclones damaging an asset. But, the big question is, what's the cost benefit? Should I do this, or is the asset not worth, it's too expensive to basically adapt? Now, all of this, in order to do all of this, we have built a climate Earth digital twin, which is a massive simulation engine, essentially, which understands terrain all over the world, infrastructure all over the world, energy all over the world, and buildings and physical assets. But it also understands nature and biodiversity, the things that you might need to mitigate those assets and use to adapt. It understands sovereign data, asset data, but it's all geospatially aligned and now can be analyzed in the way that you just saw very quickly. The nice thing about this is we've just introduced a way in which this can be onboarded to a corporation at zero cost, essentially, as easy as you'd onboard an app, and it talks to the API of this digital twin, and you just pay for what you use. So we've made it very nice and easy. If you want to actually play with these and look at all these companies, just get your phones out and copy this code, and you'll see a blog on our website, Riskthinking.AI, and also the vulnerability rankings for any of the companies and any of the indices. So I want to thank you once again, Emmy, for this opportunity. Wish you a lovely day out there in Idaho, and I'm sure it's going to be very interesting.